I think also what Biden's escalations against China also reflect through NATO, through the G7, through all, I mean, these are all US dominated institutions. They're just a reflection, they're just an extension and a reflection of its interests of the American empire. They're not independent bodies. It's really misleading to even frame them that way, as they're often talked about in the mainstream Western media. But I think what we're seeing is how there's a divergent path between China and the United States, and of course the kind of I wouldn't say camps, but in terms of where countries like Russia and other countries close to China who prefer trade, it's becoming most of the so-called developing world, most of the global South at this point, which would prefer to connect with China rather than disconnect from the world and be just merely puppets of the United States. Not a very attractive venture at this point, but I think what we see from the BRICS versus the BRICS summit, and then you had G7, right? And you had two completely different, a completely different orientation to things. And then you had the NATO summit, which was just icing on the cake, which just poured more gasoline onto. I mean, NATO came out and said, "Yeah, Russia's our biggest enemy, and we're all about." Basically destroying Russia. We're all about ensuring that we're safe from Russia, and we're going to do everything we can to weaken Russia. And then, oh yeah, China's over here. China's the next. It's almost like China. That's the next kind of objective. I mean, we've had defense officials, so-called diplomats, say this for a while about, okay, well, we can't fight Russia and China at the same time, but we're going to make sure we prioritize both at some level at all times. And that seems like what's happening. And I think the BRICS summit, we can get into this now. The BRICS summit really is a reflection, I think, of this entire trend where you have China and its biggest partner, Russia. But then you have countries like Brazil, which is under a right wing administration, has not pulled out of BRICS. I think that was one of the hopes that the United States and West had, was that it would pull out of all of the China-led multilateral institutions, but it has not. South Africa, and you have India. So these are very interesting countries, huge countries. They make up, I think, some 30% of global GDP, and that's only because nominal GDP is pretty limited. If we were to take purchasing power parity, it would blow the rest of the world out of the water in terms of how much these economies matter. So yeah, could you speak about this divergent trend? Like I mean, what BRICS is expanding to? If you could talk about what does BRICS kind of portend for the world? And I mean, if you could talk about what the like, are all of these machinations and policies and maneuvers from the United States and NATO and its allies, are they all geared to stopping such a thing?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of threads to pick up here. I guess one important point you made is that there is this strong divergent trend, that you've got the US and its allies going in one direction, and you've got essentially the rest of the world going in the other direction. And one real negative in all of this is, like, if we take the US position as a given, if we say, okay, the US has got its policy, the US wants to maintain its dominance, it wants to maintain the imperialist world system based around, on the one hand, on the financial side, dollar hegemony, and on the military side, well, its whole network of 800 foreign military bases, is bilateral relations with any number of countries, like any number of different national armies, its naval exercise and all the rest of it. That that's a given. We know where the US is at, and that's not really very likely to change. The US imperialist strategy, frankly, isn't going to change until the rest of the world forces it to change. What has been a little bit more up in the air in recent years, especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union, so throughout the 90s and then particularly in the noughties, is what is the position of Europe in all of this? And I think, Donald Trump would have dearly loved to have, like, really consolidated this US-led imperialist alliance with Europe coming fully on board, and he wasn't entirely successful with that. And Biden thus far has been a lot more successful, and there's a few reasons for that. One, obviously, the Ukraine crisis is a very important variable. The change of government in Germany is something that we don't speak about enough, and which is also important because, you know, Merkel, for all her faults, you know, she was essentially a ruthless imperialist politician, but also she did have some sense of the kind of inevitable nature of a multipolar future, and she did have some sense of the need to have some kind of balance, you know, with Europe in the middle, Russia and China on one side, the US on the other side. And, you know, Merkel, you know, she was part of the CDU, which is by no means a progressive organization, but she grew up in East Germany. She speaks fluent Russian, and, you know, she was just, the whole aspect of the whole outlook of German foreign policy under Merkel was, I would argue, significantly different to what you've got now with the Scholz government, which, you know, in paper, in theory at least, should be somewhat more progressive, being an alliance of the Social Democrats and the Greens. But actually, they've, you know, they're essentially, and unfortunately, we're seeing the same now with New Zealand as well, and the putatively progressive and social democratic Jacinda Ardern essentially reading off the script that's been printed for them in Washington. And I mean, the German Greens have got a pretty horrific record of supporting whatever imperialist madness is on the table, but that's another discussion. But, you know, what we are seeing is a consolidation of the imperialist bloc, which, you know, which is essentially a negative development. Like, the US has been able to persuade its European allies and its Anglo-Saxon allies, you know, Britain, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, to impose unprecedented sanctions on Belarus, unprecedented sanctions on Russia, to ramp up their contributions to NATO. You know, you've got Sweden and Finland seemingly on the verge of joining NATO, breaking what has been a very successful and a perfectly sensible policy of neutrality that they've held for the last 70 years. And all of this is coming at massive cost to ordinary people in Europe. You know, food prices have gone through the roof, energy prices have gone through the roof. And instead of helping their populations out, these governments are just ramping up their military expenditure, not to mention, you know, providing extraordinary amounts of money and extraordinary numbers of weapons to Ukraine. And, you know, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson Zhao Lijian said it a couple of days ago. He's like, you know, this conflict in Russia, between Russia and Ukraine, it's taken this heavy toll in Europe, but the US is benefiting from it. He's like, you've got the US arms dealers popping champagne, and the energy industry making exorbitant profits. You know, like cutting out Russian natural gas in Europe, that's a disaster economically, and it's also a disaster environmentally. You know, Germany's bringing its coal mines back on stream. Coal emits at least twice as much carbon dioxide as natural gas does. Meanwhile, you've got US fracking companies that are ramping up their production of shale gas, which is something that Biden incidentally promised that he'd crack down on, and then transporting it. You know, you have to transport natural gas, you have to liquefy it, you need to store it at minus 80 degrees centigrade or something like that. You can just imagine the environmental cost of that process, and then transporting it over the Atlantic. You know, so much for Biden being the climate president. So you have got, yes, you've got this divergence, and you've got the positive side of it that we'll talk about a bit more shortly, which is like global South unity, developing world unity, non-aligned unity. You know, we've got a, I would argue, an inevitable trajectory towards multipolarity. But on the other hand, the US has been able to strengthen its hand somewhat with, you know, consolidating this alliance that includes basically all of Western Europe and all of the kind of the Anglosphere.